Ladies and gentlemen, hit subscribe to this channel right now. A couple of days ago, when Trump was convicted of an unconstitutional verdict, I stated, I was one of the first people on this platform, perhaps the entire internet, to state the Supreme Court will get involved. I told everybody on this channel, and hit subscribe right now, that he would get a unanimous Supreme Court decision overturning the unconstitutional Colorado ban. That happened. I told you that he will get this month a huge victory on immunity, at least partial immunity. He'll get that victory. It's leaning in that direction. Everyone is talking about that. Now everyone is asking in media, will the Supreme Court get involved? Can they overturn his conviction? And Democrats are both livid and worried and concerned, frightened that the Supreme Court will yet again save democracy from tyranny, despotic behavior, an authoritarian, totalitarian, and tyrannical decision that relied upon a federal crime that's non-existent. The reason the Supreme Court will get involved is the following. This is Bradley Smith, the man who was not allowed to testify at the trial. Bradley Smith is one of the former FEC chairmen. He will be able to be part of, as will Hanze von Spakovsky, the other FEC chairman, he will be able to be part of the appeal to the Supreme Court before July 11th. July 11th is sentencing. They want to sentence Trump to jail. They want that vapid, cheap public relations victory where they could picture him in jail with Secret Service agents and tarnish the image of the country. The unconstitutional nature of the verdict, which is why it's going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, is that these were misdemeanors that went beyond the statute of limitations, predicated upon an imaginary federal crime. But there was no federal campaign finance law that Trump broke. We don't even know of any after the verdict. Furthermore, the FEC did not level a fine or a charge against Trump. The Department of Justice did not level a charge against Trump. Yet, the state of New York used a state court to level a federal crime and elevate misdemeanors that went beyond the statute of limitations, which is why the Supreme Court will get involved. We'll get to that and more. You'll hear Trump. You'll hear legal scholars. You will hear, right now, Bradley Smith. This is very, very important. This is exactly why the Supreme Court, in my view, has already, each of the justices have already, and I think it'll be unanimous, decided that when it gets to them, they'll overturn the conviction. And they overturn convictions all the time. Listen to Bradley Smith, ladies and gentlemen.
So Trump's indictment looks like a perversion of campaign finance laws. There are no crimes committed, or at least that's what Bradley Smith, Capital University law professor, chairman, and founder of the Institute for Free Speech. Mr. Smith is a former FEC commissioner, and he's the co-author of Voting Rights and Election Law. Brad, you're writing in the Wall Street Journal. We've been trying to get our paws on you for the show. Thank you for coming on. You're saying there was no crime.
My pleasure.
There was no crime to start with. Even if there were some issues on the so-called filing of business papers, there was still no crime.
Right. I've had a bit more time. I had the commercial break to look at the indictment a bit more, and it looks like the last couple pages of the indictment do intend to say that the crime was not disclosing campaign contributions, although they never cite a specific government statute. But here's the problem here. The prosecutor's theory goes like this. Federal law says it's a campaign contribution to make an expenditure for the purpose of influencing a federal election. Those are the key words, for the purpose of influencing. And he says, well, these payments were intended to keep her quiet, which would help the campaign, so they were for the purpose of influencing the campaign. Now, first, these payments could have been made for other reasons, right? To prevent embarrassment to his family, to preserve marital harmony, all kinds of things. But none of that really matters, because the standard here for the purpose of influencing is not a subjective standard. It's an objective one. So if I go out and I want to pay for TV ads that say, you know, Donald Trump is a ding-dong daddy from Dumas Bay, because I think that's really going to help him win re-election, it doesn't matter. Legally, that will not be for the purpose of influencing an election, no matter what my own subjective purpose was, right? It's subjective. So what counts as campaign expenditures? Things like, you don't hire a campaign manager unless you're running for office. Right. You don't take out ads saying, vote for me, unless you're running for office.
You don't purchase a Steele dossier unless you're running for office and trying to tarnish your political opponent. That's why Clinton and the Democratic National Committee were fined by the FEC. That's why Trump was not fined by the FEC. He would have paid hush money, or any celebrity would have paid hush money with or without running for president. There was no FEC crime. The entire New York guilty verdict is predicated upon an FEC crime, and you have a Federal Election Commission Chairman, Bradley Smith, who stated there was no crime. That's why it's unconstitutional.
Office. You don't hire or establish field offices unless you're running for office. But other things you do. For example, you buy clothes whether you're running for office or not. So the fact that I'm running for office and I say, I've got to look good, and I go out and I buy a $6,000 suit that I would never otherwise buy, doesn't make it a campaign expenditure. It doesn't count. Same if I say I need a $600 haircut. Or to take a more perhaps relevant example, suppose I'm a business owner and I say I'm going to run for office, and I go to my corporate lawyer and I say, there's some lawsuits against our corporation. I think they're bogus, but let's get rid of them so they don't interfere with my run. Just settle those lawsuits. You can't settle those with campaign funds. It's not a campaign expense, even though that person's subjective purpose was to influence the campaign.
By the way,
so that's a very important part of the law.
I know. I was very impressed with the $6,000 suit. That must have been a custom, bespoke suit. In your op-ed piece, it was $4,000. But I know we've had an inflation problem in the last couple of weeks. But your point here, I'm just having some fun. But your point here, Brad, if I understand it, is that you buy a suit, you get a nice haircut, whatever. You're doing it directly for the campaign. Is that correct? That's the point you're making. But if you want to
the point is, yeah.
If you want to defend yourself, your honor, keep it away from your wife, that kind of thing, which, by the way, is unproven. I mean, Stormy Daniels keeps telling people she didn't have an affair. Nobody wants to listen to her, but that's perhaps grist for another segment. But if that does not qualify because it's not directly for the campaign. Is that right? Is that my correct interpretation?
It actually goes for that. Even though you bought that suit because you were running for office and want it to look good, it's still not a campaign expenditure.
Oh.
Why? Because you buy clothes. You buy clothes whether you're running for office or not, right? And so anything that people might do, even if they're not running for office, doesn't count. So people pay money. For example, they pay divorce attorneys to try to seal up their divorce records so that those don't become an embarrassment of the campaign.
Right.
Their purpose may be to influence the campaign, but it's an expenditure that somebody who wasn't running for office might also make. The only things that count are things that come directly out of the fact that you're campaigning. And
the FEC already looked at Trump's hush money case with Stormy. The FEC dropped the case. The Federal Election Commission is part of the federal government. Trump was convicted for breaking a federal law, but there was no federal law leveled at Trump. The department of the government, the agency in charge of leveling a federal crime pertaining to campaign finance laws, did not, I repeat, did not level a charge against Trump. The state of New York or the state of Colorado, states do not have the right to level a federal charge against any citizen if the federal government refuses to do so. That's why it's unconstitutional. You don't have to know anything about the Constitution to understand that a state cannot level a federal charge against anyone if the federal government hasn't already leveled the charge. In this case, the federal government looked at it. Biden's Department of Justice didn't even touch it. The FEC dropped the case. There was no federal agency that leveled any charge against Trump pertaining to campaign finance laws. We don't know the specific statute that Trump broke. We don't know, according to the guilty verdict, the specific federal statute pertaining to taxes or campaign finance laws. That too is unconstitutional. This will be thrown out almost certainly in a unanimous manner by the Supreme Court very soon.
And the flip side of this is that it's actually illegal to convert your campaign funds then to personal use. So it's actually illegal to use your campaign funds to buy that suit. It's illegal to use your campaign funds to pay a lawyer to seal your divorce records because you think that will help your campaign. And this is the real problem you have here. Not only is there, I think, not a campaign finance violation, this underlying alleged violation, but it's a situation where they're going to get Trump coming or going, because I think, knowing Bragg, and you've set the political stage very well, had Trump paid for this with campaign funds, I think we can feel pretty certain that he would be being charged today with having illegally converted his campaign funds to personal use. In other words, they were going to get him coming or going. If he pays for it with campaign funds, they were going to say it was illegal personal use. If he doesn't pay this money with campaign funds, which was the reality, now they say, oh, well, he should have used campaign funds. And that's, you know, the antithesis of the rule of law, where you set up a system where no matter what course of action a person takes, they're going to be held in violation of the law.
Well, I mean, but how does that get up to the Federal Election Commission, which has already turned this case down once?
The FEC, the federal government, already turned down the case. Another reason that it's unconstitutional. The entire New York guilty verdict is predicated upon misdemeanors, not a federal crime. Misdemeanors that are record-keeping violations that went beyond the statute of limitations. They are then elevated to a felony instead of a misdemeanor because of a federal crime that nobody knows existed or was broken. An imaginary, invisible federal crime that nobody knows the statute they used. We don't even know the statute, the federal statute that Trump broke. Isn't that completely absurd?
Right. Well, this raises yet another question, is can, of course, a state prosecutor prosecute an alleged, quote, federal crime that the Federal Election Commission and the Department of Justice have already decided not to prosecute? We might think about it this way. Imagine if New York just passed a law saying it is a violation of the New York Penal Code to violate any federal law. And then we'll decide what federal law is violated, right? That would subvert the entire federal state structure of law. I mean, that would allow state DAs to start prosecuting anything they think is a violation of federal law, even though the federal courts or federal administrative agencies or the Department of Justice had felt it was not a violation of federal law. So it's...
Hit subscribe and share that with anyone who thinks that Trump is guilty and deserves to go to jail forever. It is not the authority of a state to level a federal crime against a citizen. You need the federal government to level the crime, and the state can also say, okay, you broke state laws as well, and you broke federal laws, and we know you broke federal laws because the Department of Justice stated that you did, or the FEC stated that you did, or the IRS, or any government agency, federal government agency. But a state cannot level federal crimes and then say, oh, well, we don't have the statute. We don't know what federal crimes that you broke, but you're guilty anyway. And we're elevating a misdemeanor, a state-level misdemeanor that went beyond the statute of limitations. We're elevating that into a felony because there's an invisible federal crime that somehow, some way you committed, yet the federal government didn't level the crime. And by the way, the federal government in this case looked at Trump's hush money and dropped the case. The same federal government that's trying desperately to, with his special counsel, to imprison Trump, they wouldn't even touch this. And so that's Bradley Smith right here, the man who was not allowed to testify. Whenever you hear any complete and utter partisan individuals say that, well, they didn't want, Trump's lawyers were incompetent. They didn't, get people to testify. The court would not allow Bradley Smith, the man you just heard, to testify. Gee, I wonder why. Why don't you think they wanted Bradley Smith to testify?
It's really getting into sort of wacky legal theories, but also I think very dangerous theories. Again, if we think about the rule of law, I don't think this can be emphasized enough that if Trump had paid for these with campaign funds, which the DA says he had to have done, I think they'd probably be chasing him today for illegal conversion of campaign funds to pay this personal expense.
We don't know that.
So this is Bradley Smith, okay? Bradley Smith, again, I want you to listen to Bradley Smith again. This is the man that is going to be one of the reasons it's overturned. The Supreme Court will get involved because this is a constitutional issue. There is a separation between state and federal government authority. You cannot convict a citizen of a state crime and a federal crime without the federal government being involved. The federal government was not involved. The statute that Trump broke, there was no statute. There was no federal statute that Trump broke. You can hear Bradley Smith again. He's the former Federal Election Commission chairman who was not allowed to testify. This is why I think it'll be a unanimous decision in the Supreme Court. Hopefully, it has to be before July 11th.
Many of them running for re-election as incumbents. They're using tax dollars. It influences the campaign. Why aren't they indicted?
Well, we know why they're not indicted, right? Because we don't want to indict them. But no, it's a good example of things that influence the campaign. And it's worth noting that under the FEC's regulations, if you're an incumbent office holder, you're presumed to be running for re-election. So you're all presumed to be candidates unless they've announced that they're not seeking re-election. So they would be candidates, and this is something that they probably did to influence their future campaign or their perception as office holders. And one thing that's worth adding here, Mark, is because I hear this from people all the time, and even some other, election people who know election law, lawyers and some former other commissioners will say, yes, but it was to influence an election. But the FEC in its regulations very specifically rejected the idea that even as to whether it was primarily to influence the election or not, and choosing instead this test that it has to be an obligation that was created for the election. In other words, they didn't want to get into the question of trying to guess, well, did they do this primarily for the election or primarily for personal purposes? And it's very specific about that in the regulations. And I think that's a very important point that people need to keep in mind. And that was done actually to make it more objective and actually to prevent candidates from using their campaign funds for personal use. But, that's the flip side. And I tell people, imagine if you're a lawyer for the Trump campaign and you want to do it all right. You've got one provision of the statute says I have to pay it with campaign funds. Another provision seems to say I can't pay it with campaign funds. Somebody's going to get them coming or going, and that's part of the problem.
So if you're a lawyer for the Trump...
Now, you heard Bradley Smith, and this is directly related to the Supreme Court decision that's upcoming. They're going to give Trump a unanimous victory, but it could be 7-2. I think you'll even get a liberal justice or all of the liberal justices. The FEC, former FEC chairman, have stated there was no federal crime. You just heard Bradley Smith. Now you're going to hear Hans A. von Spakovsky, another FEC chairman. These people worked for the federal government. These people were the head of the department in the federal government in charge of campaign finance laws. They have both stated there was no federal crime and that this is not only absurd but completely unconstitutional. The Supreme Court will get involved. And I was the first one to talk about the Supreme Court, ladies and gentlemen, several days back. Now the entire planet is talking about it.
Well, I have the same reaction Francis Hakes does. This is a travesty, a miscarriage of justice. This was a phony prosecution from the very beginning. And for this jury, think about how many weeks this trial went on, how many witnesses came in, and in the very short time that the jury was out, they decided he was guilty on all 34 charges. This is a damage to the reputation of the American justice system like we have never seen. I have a colleague just got back from a conference overseas, and the reaction of lawyers and people there was that the United States has now gotten to be like the countries they are from, where the government uses its law enforcement powers to go after its political opponents. And that, I think, is exactly what happened here.
Hans, what was the underlying federal campaign violation?
So this is the Federal Election Commission, former federal FEC chairman Hans A. von Spakovsky. You heard former FEC chairman Bradley Smith say the same thing that Mr. von Spakovsky is going to say. He works for the Heritage Foundation. Subscribe to the Heritage Foundation YouTube channel. Also, there was no federal crime. You're going to hear it right now. 2 FEC chairmen state there was no federal crime, and also the FEC looked at it. The federal government looked at it, dropped the hush money case. We still don't know the statute, which is also unconstitutional, that Trump is guilty of, a federal statute. You can't just convict somebody and not tell the world what federal statute, and you can't do so on a state level without the Department of Justice getting involved. So the whole thing is riddled with unconstitutional nonsense.
Did we ever find that out?
Well, there was nothing in the original indictment about any kind of federal campaign violation. They kept saying that the legal expenses, which is what were listed in the business records, should have been a campaign-related expense, the payment that was made to Stormy Daniels. But as Brad Smith, I know, would have testified, under the test applied by the FEC, this was not a campaign-related expense, period. There's just no question about that. So for this jury to say that, oh yeah, he violated federal campaign finance laws and that justifies the underlying verdict, that is such an egregious mistake that at the Court of Appeals in New York, when they get this case, they ought to reverse this almost immediately because of this and so many other mistakes made in the case.
How many do you count? How many mistakes?
I lost count of how many errors were made by this judge and by the prosecution. I mean, the judge let in all kinds of irrelevant evidence that had no bearing on the charges against the president, but were obviously there to blacken the character of Donald Trump. The judge shouldn't have even been on the case. He should have recused himself because of his personal family dealings, his daughter's involvement, his making political contributions in violation of the ethics rules in New York. There are just so many mistakes and errors he made that I don't see how a Court of Appeals could not overturn this verdict.
All right, here is why, and we'll get to one of his lawyers talking about the Supreme Court, Alina Habba. The Supreme Court will get involved, and here's why. One of the reasons, in addition to the fact that the 2 FEC chairmen stated there was no federal crime. The timeline is important. Listen to this.
Jonathan Turley, law professor, Washington University. Which university? It's Washington. George Washington. That's the one. Well, Turley says he is convinced that the decision will be reversed, either in the state or the federal system. Do you agree with that? But more to the point, when might it be reversed?
Right. So they have a lot of significant potential appellate issues. But a couple of things. Number one, an appeal would not be heard most likely for at least a year before the intermediate appellate court hears it. And number two, politics should not play a role in these things, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that every single appellate judge in New York, both in the intermediate court and the high court, is a Democratic appointee.
Wait a second. If he runs in the election, Trump's in the election, and he loses, but then after the election, his conviction on these felony counts is reversed,
right?
Then what?
Then there's no recourse other than too bad, so sad.
But that's outrageous.
No confidence in the judicial system.
I mean, that just sinks my confidence. You're right, Lauren. That sinks my confidence in the judicial system. That's right.
Appeal rarely heard in less than a year, and you're talking about a voluminous transcript. And so
the Supreme Court must get involved. They're going to jail Trump. They want to jail Trump. The Supreme Court, as you've heard from this former prosecutor, has to get involved before July 11th. Okay? They have to. Okay, and I think they will. There's a legal avenue to demanding or asking the Supreme Court to look at this on an expedited basis because of the fact that he's running for president. The Republican National Committee Convention is what, the 14th? Sentencing is the 11th. And the entire case is predicated upon a federal crime that is non-existent. So this is the epitome of what an unconstitutional guilty verdict, of why an unconstitutional guilty verdict would be overturned.
So many potential appellate issues, that makes it even longer potentially.
Now, does it have to be all 34 counts reversed?
Most likely the same issues would have impacted all of the counts. So my suspicion is that if there were a reversal, it would affect all 34 equally.
If he is sentenced to jail, I think it's July the 11th, I believe, right before
Correct.
the Republican convention. If he's sentenced to jail, will he actually go to jail?
Well, I think he shouldn't be sentenced to jail because it's the lowest level felony.
They are 100% going to sentence Trump to actual jail. They want his Secret Service to be around him. I have zero confidence that they'll act in the civil, humane, just, diplomatic manner they've always wanted Trump to act. They are out for what they consider justice, which is injustice. I mean, they have been accusing Trump of everything under the sun. They accused him of being a Kremlin operative. He wasn't. They have distorted everything he's ever said. Journalists, publications have run stories of current and former U.S. officials, which is pure gossip and hearsay and complete nonsense, accusing Trump of saying this, saying that, doing this, doing that, without a shred of evidence. They've distorted his actual words. They did everything from try to infiltrate and surveil his campaign and presidency to what they're doing now. He's going to get a huge victory on immunity. They tried to ban him in all 50 states with the Colorado decision. What makes anyone think they're not going to want to jail him? They are convinced it's the only way they can win. They cannot win on merit because everyone thinks that the current occupant, mashed potato brains in the Oval Office, stinks. So the economy is terrible. We're on the brink of a stock market and crypto crash. Interest rates, inflation, way too high. Foreign policy has been an unmitigated, unparalleled disaster. Domestic policies like immigration, unparalleled disaster. Even Democrats are now acting like Trump. They want Trump's policies. And so this current administration's a complete failure. So what do they have? Well, they want to get people tired and fatigued. They want to get people tired of their apoplectic reaction to Trump. They want the country to descend into such turmoil, madness, discontent, that people who might otherwise vote for Trump would say, you know what, there's just too much heat. Democrats act in too deranged and apoplectic and hysterical of a manner, so we won't vote for Trump. Maybe we'll get a good, nice Republican like Nikki Haley or DeSantis, and they'll be nice to them, and they won't indict and try to imprison them forever, which, of course, is nonsense because that's what Democrats do now. They actually commit the crimes with private servers, top secret and special access program intelligence on private servers, which is impossible to transfer onto a server, highly illegal and completely impossible from a cybersecurity perspective. And they're the ones with 50 intel agents lying about a laptop full of bribery and graft schemes that the New York Post, Daily Mail, and others broke. The New York Post, when they broke the story, should have received a Pulitzer Prize. Instead, we couldn't talk about it because social media algorithms prevented us from talking about it. This is what Democrats are up to. They're the authoritarians and totalitarians and tyrants and despots silencing legitimate stories about their corruption and then trying to imprison their direct political rivals while they impeach Trump on a phone call. Trump's phone call was impeachable, but them trying to imprison Trump for an absurd statute for an absurd record-keeping violation that was elevated to a felony because of a statute of limitations. They're trying so desperately to get him in prison. That's not an example of totalitarian, despotic behavior. But anyway, let's continue.
In the state, he does not have a criminal record, and so it would be the exception rather than the rule to sentence someone in those circumstances to jail. But they would move for a stay of sentence pending appeal, because when you have a short jail term, you would essentially be deprived of the benefit of the appeal if you served the full term before the appeal was heard.
I think I'm following this. Convoluted legalistic logic, if you ask me. But what kind of a precedent do these guilty verdicts create?
Think of it this way. We've been having federal elections within the confines of New York State since it was founded 230 years ago. No one has ever been charged before with a business records violation arising from a federal election ever before in those 230 years.
Well, what kind of precedent does that set for elections in the future?
It makes you worry about the weaponization of the criminal justice system, and everyone should always do the shoe on the other foot test before they celebrate a verdict like that.
So this is the weaponization of the judicial.
They want to jail Trump. They want him in jail because the average American knows that Hunter's laptop or Clinton's servers were a crime. The average American knows this is not a crime. They want independents, a certain percentage of independents, and even a certain percentage of Republicans. Small, it might be, 1, 2, 3%. They want people, because if they can just make it close, they want people to say, look, we haven't done a good job, but at least we're not in jail with our Secret Service detail. Look, I mean, isn't the Democratic Party better, even though we fail at everything, than having Trump, who's a convicted felon, in jail? Isn't that embarrassing? And then you get people who aren't really interested in politics, in like certain independents, saying, oh gosh, I'm so tired of the chaos and the mayhem and the hysteria and the apoplectic reaction to Trump from Democrats. So let's just, I don't know if I want to. I like Trump, but I don't know if I want to vote for him. That's what they want. They ain't going to get it, though, because, dun dun dun, the Supreme Court will save the day, thank God, like they did with the Colorado ban.
Saying this is just, a thing, to get the statement out there, Trump's a convicted felon, because they know they're going to get it overturned on appeal.
Right.
I mean, Harvey Weinstein's conviction was overturned by the New York Appeals Court, but that wasn't until 4 years later. Do you guys plan to go to as high as the Supreme Court?
If we have to, we will. We have no problem with that. As you know, we've taken those matters that we think are incredibly important to validating and preserving the Constitution that our country was made on. There were incredible constitutional violations in this whole proceeding, including the current gag order that's on me, the president, and anybody that works for him. It's crazy. So, look, if we care about America, we have to fight for it. And his legal team is prepared to do so in whatever way we need to do.
Show what Ellie Honig said, that this was a contortion and really a twisting of the law here. It was an ill-conceived, unjustified mess, this case. The critics are saying this is a political case. It would not have happened to anyone else in America if their name was not Trump. The danger now is the New York justice system is in the zone of having its integrity destroyed for political purposes. This case is about Biden, way behind in the polls, abusing the legal system. That top DOJ official left his powerful number 3 job in Biden's DOJ to go after Trump in a local case with a pro-Biden judge who donated to causes like Stop Republicans and a DA who literally campaigned on getting Trump.
Interesting, there's a top-level Biden official, DOJ official, third most powerful in the DOJ, goes to work for the state conviction of Trump, and yet nobody knows what the federal statute is that he broke. Completely unconstitutional.
Yeah. Yeah, you couldn't have said it better myself. Honestly, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's 100% true. I think it's a sad thing for our country, to be honest, when you see this kind of desperation, when you see an administration who should be focused on running the country. Instead, their focus is completely and totally on trying to take down President Trump because he has no loyalty to anybody but America. He can't be bought. Everybody knows that. He put America first. Everybody knows that. And we've got a president that today smirked in front of the camera. I mean, that says it all. The smirk to me is louder than his words. It's louder than anything else. It's not louder than the White House logs that show that state constituent DAs and AGs are visiting the White House. All of this put together says one thing. We are in trouble and we need to act now. That is November. President Trump said it. November 5th will be the real verdict, and I stand beside that.
Alina, what about this? Trump lawyer Todd Blanche told Jesse Waters that prosecutors from DA Bragg's office were meeting with witnesses and talking about reviving this case starting way back in 2018. The DOJ and FEC had dropped it. And boom, when Trump announced he was...
The DOJ and FEC dropped the case. That's another reason why it's unconstitutional. You can't have a state decide on federal statutes that a criminal broke without the federal government agreeing to which statutes the alleged criminal broke.
Was running for re-election in 2022. Then DA Bragg launches it. What do you think?
I think it's obvious. First of all, it wasn't just DA Bragg. It was Cy Vance first. He said no. Cy Vance says no. DA Bragg says no. Mark Pomerantz, who they had come to handle this case, who is a friend of the Clintons and everybody else, comes in, is angry that they didn't bring the charges, leaves, writes a book about it, and they still don't bring it. When did they bring the charges? The minute President Trump said he was running for office. That's when they indicted him. This was past the statute of limitations. It is 8 years old. All rules don't apply when you're Trump. For crying out loud, Hochul made a rule. She made a law.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Vox, The Guardian, Axios, Newsweek, Huffington Post. I'm not making anything up. I'm using public record, very reputable sources, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone is talking about this because they know what's on the horizon. Trump is going to get the Supreme Court to overturn this. If he already got the Colorado State Supreme Court in a unanimous decision overturned, this is even easier. This should be even easier for Trump because it's a blatantly unconstitutional conviction right in the middle of a presidential campaign. Listen to Alan Dershowitz talking about all the constitutional problems here.
Biden is dead wrong. We should not respect the legal system that is rigged. In my book, Get Trump, I predicted months before this case ever came to trial that it was a foregone conclusion there'd be a conviction. A biased judge, a biased jury, a biased prosecutor, a man who ran for office on the theory of let's find the crime to prosecute Trump for, and they couldn't find the crime, so they made it up. We're now a day after the verdict. I've known criminal law. I've been involved in criminal law 60 years. I still don't know what the crime is.
Right.
Was he found guilty of intending to violate tax laws, to violate the federal election laws, to defraud the voters? I still don't know, and we're a day after this. This is the most outrageous case. You know, everybody knows the quote from Lavrenti Beria, the head of the KGB, and Stalin, when Beria said to Stalin,
show me the man and I'll show you the crime.
No, find you the crime.
Find you the crime, yeah.
Tried to find the crime, and he couldn't. So he made up the crime. He took it a step further than Stalin and Lavrenti Beria. This case will go down in history as one of the most abusive prosecutions since the trial of Aaron Burr back in 18 whatever it was. This is a stain on our criminal justice
really is.
system.
And by the way, you're not the only liberal Democrat saying that. We had this the direct
that Trump got convicted, even though I can tell you, I get calls, whispered calls from liberal Democrat friends of mine saying you're 100% right, but I won't say it publicly. because I'm so thrilled that Trump got convicted, even though the conviction was outrageous. You get a lot of liberals who believe with Ellie Honig and me that this is an unjustified conviction. We're willing to say it, but they're not willing to say it. And there's dancing on the streets, and there are people who are just, I get these emails. They're so thrilled that we violated the Constitution in order to get Trump. I have people telling me getting Trump elected is worse than undoing the Constitution. That's how extreme some of these people are. And, you know,
that's an example of good old-fashioned, morally superior, highly educated liberal narcissism.
It's not only this case, it's the three other cases. I go over each of them in my book, Get Trump, and every single one of them is based on conceptions that are in violation of the rule of law. This was the weakest case. This was the worst case, but it was in a very good jurisdiction.
But even Professor Dershowitz, did you imagine in your book or even a few weeks ago that the judge himself would bring so much of that prejudice? People are allowed to have their opinions. People are allowed to be inconsistent. But the judge is supposed to keep prejudice out of the courtroom. And his instructions to the jury, I've never seen anything like it. Somebody just called it a roadmap to conviction, which is essentially what it was. The judge is supposed to be neutral, if anything, on the side of the defense. He said he was going to prevent it from happening. Here's Donald Trump talking about it this morning. Roll tape.
But the three things that he pled on, having to do with the election and having to do essentially a little bit with me, they weren't crimes. They weren't crimes. Nor is paying money under an NDA.
So again, he was convicted of things that weren't crimes.
Of course he was. Not only that, but the federal government manipulated the plea of Cohen to include Trump precisely in order to get this kind of argument that could be made. But it's pure hearsay. I mean, if Cohen thinks that Trump is guilty and pleaded guilty to a crime involving Trump, that's not relevant. So this case should easily be reversed based on the New York Court of Appeals decision in the Harvey Weinstein case.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Supreme Court is getting involved. Now it's just a countdown until the Supreme Court gets involved. Hopefully, has to be before July 11th, unless they postpone sentencing and prolong the date. I told you there would be a unanimous Supreme Court verdict. I said it would be a 9-0. If you watch the channel, I told you there'd be a decision, a very good decision with immunity. That's on the horizon. Trump's going to win. I said years back that Clinton would lose to Trump. Nobody believed that. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, it's a countdown to November 5th, but it's also a countdown to the Supreme Court getting involved. They will save democracy. This was the antithesis of democracy. This tarnished the rule of law. And another very vapid, cheap, sad political stunt by Democrats that will not work out for them politically, will only make Trump stronger. But the thing is, he can't be jailed. That would be a bad thing. That would be the only potential way. If he was jailed, he would win a tremendous amount of support. I still think he'd win the presidency, but that would give them possibly an avenue to somehow taking a victory in November, just because of the insidious nature of what they're trying to do. Anyway, hit subscribe to this channel. The Supreme Court is going to get involved. I think they've already made their decision, the individual justices, and I think that there's already enough support, more than enough support, to overturn everything with the 6-3 conservative Supreme Court. They already overturned the Colorado ban. It's just a matter of time before they overturn this verdict. Hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow, everybody.